In this little video clip, I'm going to show you how you can bind the edges of your armhole. I'm going to show you a very traditional way with hand stitching. So we're sewing in from one side, rolling to the outside and hand stitching. And on this side, we are going to use pre-ironed tape, and we're again sewing it on from the inside, rolling to the outside, but this time we're going to use the machine. Now we're going to look at bias binding that we can use to bind the armhole, and you've got different options. You have a pre-ironed bias binding, which you can get from Joann's and all sorts of other places, and it's fairly stiff and rigid and thick, and it's not ideal for use. If you live in the UK, you'll find all manner of really soft, beautiful patterned bias binding that you can buy, and failing that you can do your own. So here you can see I've started doing one in pink for myself, which I think is very nice. You could use any lightweight cotton fabric that you like. Here you can see a little bit of dupion silk, and I've cut that into bias bindings, very soft and ideal for what we're going to do. So what I do is, when I have got some fabric left over, you can see that here's the grain and that's the selvage. I cut myself a strip straight across the corner of the fabric where I had some left over. It is very flimsy very often, and that's a good thing. The more flimsy, the better it will bind, and the less it will intrude on the actual thing that you're binding. So here is your trusty helper. You can use any regular starch. This is one I picked up from Joann's, which I'm going to give a really good shake. And that is how you can get even organza bias binding onto items. And you just spray it on and iron it in. And what will happen is that your fabric will be nice and stiff, but it won't be thick. So you have a nice and stiff bias binding, but you do not have something that is as rigid and horrible as this stuff that you get from the shops, like Joann's. It really isn't very nice. So now I've ironed it on, and I don't know if you can see it, but it creases like paper already. It's really cool. So I'm going to do that for the whole length, and then I'm going to cut myself a strip of bias binding, and I'm going to go for 4 centimeter width because that's easy. I'm just going to iron this in. It's a good way to work with very flimsy fabrics, whatever you do. So for example, you have a really flimsy crepe de chine, you're making a top, and it moves all over the shop even while you cut it out. It's a good idea to starch the whole lot, because as you work with it, the starch will disappear, and if it isn't that, then you just put it in a bit of water, you know, give it a little bit of a hand rinse after, and all your starch will come out and you have a floaty garment. Next step is to put your long strip of bias binding on top of each other. Always keep some in your stash. When you've got stuff left over, cut yourself some bias. Once you've done that, you will see if it's not quite straight, because the fabric now will be absolutely flat. So if I put my ruler on here, I can see, phew, when I cut before, I'd been going off the line a little bit, so I can trim that off. And now I'm going to measure across my 4 centimeters here and here. Go over, and now I can cut it. It's a good idea to have some weight there so it can't move anywhere. And then I'm just going to trim this off before I even start. It's nice and straight. And then I do my next one. Got my beautiful bias binding. And this will be really easy to work with now. So the trick is, if you have a lightweight fabric, which is the best for binding, give it a good starching and you're set to go. The next step is really simple. You grab your armhole and you attach your bias binding, folding in one edge here, and you pin this all the way around. I tend to not pin this, I just go for it. I just put this under the sewing machine and sew it on, but for you guys, I'm just gonna do this. We're gonna loosely put this on. You do not want to pull this at all. You just want to put it on as it is. When you are doing some proper binding, of course, like a neckline, then you will remember that you'll have to pull it a little bit so that we get a beautiful neckline. Now we're not going to do that here because that would not look great at all, not on this stuff. So go over it. You can remove that pin, put this in, and then when it rolls over, yeah, we get a really clean edge. I start on the inside. Can now cut this off. Actually, I can start on the inside for one reason, and that is so that when I do my top stitching from the outside, that is the bit which you are going to see, and we want that to be nicer than the inside, so it's easiest to do it like that. So I've got I can pop over to the sewing machine and sew this in with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now everything's sewn on, I can now take this and I roll it to the outside. So I'm just gonna let this stand up here, and I start on the side that's easiest, and I just fold this in and roll it over so that it just sits on my stitching line. And if I've done good work, this will all be very even. So work your way around, fold it in. Right, I'm gonna just cut off the tip as long as I've got enough to fold over here. So I can go straight over it. It's easier if you're doing it by hand. Look at that. Very, very nice looking. I wouldn't bother folding this in if you use the stuff from Joann's because it'll just be way too thick. But if you make your own, then that's okay. You can do that. There we go. Wow. I think that's very nice. When I used to make my wedding party stuff, which I did at a wedding shop, I did it like this all the time, and it looks so nice. You can see it now here. And for this method, it's just one or many really, I'm going to slip stitch this all the way around. We want our little knot pulled away, so make sure that's on the inside. It doesn't hang out over here somewhere. Put it in front of you. I'm going to take my pin out, and the key to good slip stitching is you go in here like a tunnel, come out a bit, grab a bit of your fabric and then pull it tight. It's like really simple. There we go. Pull a little bit. There we are. You can also now still adjust it a little if you know you need to. The nice thing is you can, by doing it by hand, you can make sure that it sits right next to that stitching line, so it looks really nice and professional. And there we go again. Yeah, through and through. Just make sure you don't do one of these things where you actually catch it like that and go through that. That will not look nice. That looks homemade. You want to keep people guessing how you did it. I'm going, how did she do that? Yeah, tunnel through, come out. There we go. And I think I won't bore you with this. I'll finish this and then we can do the other side with a different method and see what that looks like. And there we go. That's beautiful. I've also slip stitched across here, obviously. This looks really, really nice. And for everyone that wanted it cleaner than this, you could sew this together before you start. I think that looks really nice. Plus, of course, and this is the important thing, guess what? You have the bias binding. It sits in here and it also pushes to the outside. And it's almost like you've got a little shoulder pad in there. So that's a really nice way to look more structural. It's a really, really good thing to do. So I've done the one side like that. Now let's use my homemade bias binding for this side, but this time we're going to press it. So the first thing to do with your bias binding is to iron it to the center. Right, so next thing to do is to press this to the center, but not quite to the center. So you're stopping a little bit shy of it. otherwise it's going to be thick and bulgy in that middle as well. So I'm going to do that. So we're going to do the other side now as well. Also to that center, leaving a little gap. The next step is really important. We're going to fold this over, but we're not going to fold it all the way to the edge. We're going to fold it so we've got a tiny little bit standing. And I'm going to do that all the way along, and you can see here that one is not quite to the edge. That's what we're looking for. If you can't quite do it and it goes all the way to the other side, why, so be it. It doesn't really matter too much, but it's a good habit to get into. I just want to demonstrate the bias binding tool if you've got one. This is 2.5 centimeters. And what you really need is 5 centimeters to go through here. And I can help myself with a little pin to push my binding through to the other side. Pull this over. And the idea is actually really simple. And then you have your iron on here. That's basically the idea. And then you just follow it along, and as it comes out the other side, keep it steady on that side. Of course, this would make your work a lot easier if that's the width that you want to use. You can very quickly create bias tape. You can see it's still got this gap, so again I could iron it. We've just got that little bit showing. We've got a nice width here as well that you could use, because it is still a little bit less than your seam allowance, or should be at least. Yeah, it's like 1 centimeter. So if your seam allowance is 1 centimeter, this would be perfect as well. So you can use one of those little super gadgets too. Now we're going to sew it to the armhole, so that the hand version over here looking very nice, but it does look homemade. I think it's nice like that. I like it, but some of you might not. So let's do the other option as well. And I'm just going to cut this back a bit so there isn't so much standing in my bias binding. Yeah, don't cut it back to your seam, just cut it so it's nice and straight and, you know, nothing standing over. Just give it a good trim all the way around, just the top edge of it, so it's nice and straight. And then I'm looking forward to you telling me which one of these options you actually prefer. So I'm going to just cut this off here, and we're doing exactly the same, starting on the inside. Important thing is that you now use the bias that's shorter, so that the longer one is the one that we sew on from the outside. So when it's rolled, when it's rolled over and we're stitching on here, we're actually catching it. This time I am not even folding it in, just so we see something different. There we go. And I'm just going to line it up with the edge as I go. So what we want to do here is always sew from the inside. That's always the same. We're lining up the fabric with the edge of the fabric, so we've got the bias right sitting on that edge, and then we're going to stitch right in the crease where we've pressed. It's dead easy. I'm doing it with white thread, so it's easy to see as well. Again, you don't want to pull on your bias, you just want to get it on nice and flat. Keep moving your fabric round. Now I'm coming to the point where it's going to overlap. I can just cut this off. Give this a cut off. Now it's in all the way around. All I have to do is with this, obviously turn it to the other side, and I can just put my pins in. And at this point, you could do it by hand and you can do it by machine. We're going to do the machine version here because we've already done the hand version. There are so many ways you can do bias binding. You might want to check out my bias binding school. I've got tons of little tips and tricks there because, to be fair, I'm doing it differently. Whoops, this is the one problem with the pins. They keep peeking you. I'm doing it different depending what fabric I use, you know, what I think is easiest. Most of the time this stuff I would just overlock, but if you haven't got an overlocker, then this of course looks great. I think if you're a beginner, it's probably easier for you to iron it in first so you know exactly what you're doing. So let's have a look at this. And I did what you would do with stuff that you buy from the shop. I did not turn this in. I could have done, you can sew it together, you know. There is really no rule to this other than do it neatly. Now slip stitch it by hand or do it by machine. We're going to do it by machine. Now here I would actually take the arm off, and for any bigger size you'll be able to just push this over the arm and it'll be quite simple to do. I'm doing the 18 months old, so this is not quite as simple. So I'm kind of pushing it over and then I'm just going to have to move it around as I go. I'm stitching close to the edge here, just next to it. Just keep moving it with your finger, it's fine. If you're worried about stitches being uneven, you can take the pin out. I sure wish I had a bigger sleeve here. This is the smallest, so it's easier on the other ones. Now we can have a final look from the outside. I've stitched close to the edge, as you can see here, all the way around. I have done this with white thread so you can really see when it's not right. And I've done white on the inside so you can see, because we've ironed it really well, it's just about coated, right? You might find that if you have never done this before, you will not catch it. It'll slip off regardless. And then maybe the hand version is the better option for you, even though it doesn't look quite as snazzy as this does. The alternative is, of course, to iron it and then slip stitch it. I'm just going to pop this on and give it a good press. So again, it's up to you what method you use. One of them is certainly the hand stitching is easier if you are a beginner sewer. Once this is ironed now, it also looks really nice. So the fact that we iron the crease in after, see, doesn't really matter, and I think it looks very, very neat. I'll be very interested to hear what you guys have to say. Which method did you do? Which method do you prefer? Which do you prefer? That certainly looks more commercial. I think this is quite nice. This feels softer as well than this. This feels harder, partly because we starched it, but also because of the method. I'm not sure which I prefer, actually. I think they both have merit, and provided you don't use white thread like I have, they'll all both look fantastic. That was the end of our little jacket. I love how the bias binding feels in here. It really makes it stand to attention here. That's brilliant, because that's actually what you want. You want this to stand up into the sleeve and give it that form and structure. That's really, really nice. All we have to do now is to find a really nice button and put it on.